When prejudice steals opportunity, karma delivers justice in real time. What you're about to witness is the moment when Hollywood politics met authentic capability, and a stolen role became the most humiliating lesson in entertainment history. This isn't just about casting decisions. This is about what happens when racism disguised as business sense encounters talent that can't be denied. Subscribe now for more explosive moments when Hollywood's ugly politics met undeniable talent and learned why authentic capability always wins in the end. These stories of justice and karma will restore your faith in what really matters. What happens when a major star uses his influence to steal a role from someone more qualified, then has to face that person on set? In 1965, Glenn Ford thought he had secured the Western role of a lifetime through political maneuvering and industry connections. But when Sammy Davis Jr. arrived on the Thunder Mesa set, what followed proved that talent stolen is talent that will inevitably expose the thief. This is the devastating story of how authentic capability destroyed manufactured authority forever. January 1965. Thunder Mesa was shaping up to be the most prestigious Western production of the year, with a $4 million budget and the kind of scope that attracted Hollywood's biggest names. The lead role of Marshal Thompson required an actor who could embody both intellectual authority and physical capability, someone who could make audiences believe in Western heroism through authentic performance rather than just star power. The initial casting process had been thorough and professional. Director George Stevens had interviewed dozens of candidates, but one performer had stood out immediately: Sammy Davis Jr., whose screen test had demonstrated not just acting ability, but the kind of natural Western authenticity that couldn't be manufactured or imitated. Sammy's audition was extraordinary, recalled casting director Marion Doherty. He understood the character's psychology, embodied the physical requirements effortlessly, and brought a depth to the role that elevated the entire script. He was clearly the best choice for Marshal Thompson. Studio executives at Columbia Pictures were initially supportive of Stevens' casting decision, recognizing that Sammy's involvement would bring both artistic credibility and box office appeal to the production. But Hollywood in 1965 was still operating under racial assumptions that often overrode merit-based decision-making, and powerful actors understood how to exploit those assumptions for personal advantage. Glenn Ford, whose career was built on Western roles but whose recent performances had been criticized as mechanical and uninspired, saw Thunder Mesa as an opportunity to revitalize his reputation in the genre that had made him famous. More importantly, Ford understood that his established relationship with Columbia Pictures gave him leverage that transcended audition results and directorial preferences. Glenn had been with Columbia for 15 years, recalled studio executive Mike Frankovich. He had what we called favored nation status, essentially veto power over major casting decisions that could affect his own career trajectory. Ford's campaign to secure the Marshal Thompson role was systematic and politically sophisticated. Instead of challenging Sammy's qualifications directly, he focused on what he presented as practical business considerations. Glenn's argument was all about marketability and audience expectations. Remembered producer William Wyler, who observed the behind-the-scenes maneuvering. He claimed that Western audiences weren't ready for black leading men, and that casting Sammy would hurt box office performance in key markets. The argument was carefully constructed to avoid appearing overtly racist while achieving racist results through supposedly objective business analysis. Ford supplemented his marketability arguments with personal lobbying of Columbia executives, emphasizing his loyalty to the studio and his track record of profitable Western films. Glenn made it clear that his continued relationship with Columbia depended on securing this role. Recalled executive Harry Cohn Jr., he positioned it as a test of whether the studio valued established relationships or experimental casting choices. The pressure campaign was effective because it exploited studio executives' natural conservatism and their preference for avoiding any risk that could affect profitability. Director George Stevens fought for his original casting decision, arguing that artistic integrity should override political considerations. But he was overruled by executives who prioritized maintaining Ford's goodwill over supporting directorial vision. George was furious about the casting change, remembered assistant director Robert Rilliea. He knew that Ford was less qualified for the role and that the decision was based on politics rather than performance capability. But studio politics won over artistic merit. The official announcement came in February 1965. Glenn Ford would star as Marshal Thompson in Thunder Mesa, with Sammy Davis Jr. relegated to a supporting role as the town's saloon entertainer, a casting decision that satisfied racial assumptions while allowing the studio to claim they were being progressive by including Sammy at all. Ford was triumphant, believing that his political maneuvering had secured not just a role but validation of his continued relevance in Western cinema. But what Ford didn't anticipate was that working alongside the actor he had displaced would create opportunities for direct comparison that would expose exactly why the original casting decision had been superior. Production began in April 1965 on location in Arizona, with Ford confident that his performance would justify the studio's faith in his star power and political influence. The first weeks of filming proceeded normally, with Ford delivering competent but uninspired performance as Marshal Thompson. His approach to the role was professional but mechanical, lacking the depth and authenticity that the character required. Glenn was going through the motions of being a Western hero, observed cinematographer Loyal Griggs. He hit his marks, delivered his lines, and looked good in the costume, but there was no spark, no authentic connection to the character or the Western setting. Meanwhile, Sammy's supporting role as saloon entertainer Danny Blue was bringing unexpected energy and authenticity to every scene he appeared in. Despite being relegated to secondary status, Sammy's natural charisma and genuine understanding of Western character dynamics were elevating the entire production. The contrast became obvious to everyone on set, creating an uncomfortable awareness that the wrong actor was playing the lead role. The crisis reached its peak during the third week of filming, when a scheduling conflict required Ford to miss 2 days of shooting for a previous commitment. Director Stevens, frustrated with Ford's uninspired performance, made a decision that would expose the magnitude of the casting mistake. George decided to use Glenn's absence to film some of the Marshal Thompson scenes with Sammy as a stand-in, recalled script supervisor Meta Rebner. It was supposed to be just blocking and camera setup, but George kept the cameras rolling to see what would happen. What happened was a revelation that would haunt Glenn Ford for the rest of his career. Sammy, reading Marshal Thompson's lines while standing in for the absent Ford, transformed the character completely. His interpretation was deeper, more authentic, and more compelling than anything Ford had delivered in 3 weeks of filming. It was immediately obvious that we were watching the performance the role was meant to have, remembered Stevens. Sammy understood Marshal Thompson in ways that Glenn never had, and his natural authority made the character come alive in ways we'd never seen before. The crew was mesmerized by Sammy's impromptu performance, and Stevens made the unprecedented decision to film several complete scenes with Sammy playing the lead role, ostensibly as backup footage, but really as documentation of what Thunder Mesa could have been with proper casting. When Ford returned to set on Thursday morning, he found a crew that had just witnessed 3 days of superior performance from the actor he had displaced through political maneuvering. The atmosphere was tense and uncomfortable, with everyone aware that they had seen evidence of the casting mistake but unable to acknowledge it directly. Ford sensed the change immediately. "What happened while I was gone?" he asked Stevens during their first meeting. "We got some good work done," Stevens replied diplomatically, though his tone carried implications that Ford found disturbing. As filming resumed, the contrast between Ford's mechanical performance and the memory of Sammy's authentic interpretation created an atmosphere of professional disappointment that affected everyone involved. But the situation reached its breaking point during the filming of the climactic confrontation scene, when Marshal Thompson was supposed to face down the film's villain in a high-stakes gunfight that would define the character's heroism. Ford's approach to the scene was technically competent but emotionally hollow. He delivered his lines professionally and executed his movements according to the script, but the performance lacked the kind of authentic authority that made Western heroism believable. Stevens called cut after Ford's third attempt, clearly dissatisfied with what he was getting from his leading man. "Glenn, the scene needs more authority," Stevens explained. "Marshal Thompson has to command respect, not just demand it. The audience needs to believe that this man can protect an entire town through force of character." Ford tried again, applying more intensity to his delivery, but the performance remained superficial rather than authentic. It was Sammy who provided the solution, though it would prove devastating for Ford's ego and career. "George, would it help if I demonstrated the character's psychology?" Sammy asked diplomatically. "I could read the scene to help Glenn find the emotional core." Stevens agreed immediately, recognizing an opportunity to show Ford what authentic Western authority looked like when it was performed by someone who genuinely understood the character. What followed was a masterclass in Western performance that exposed every weakness in Ford's interpretation while demonstrating why Sammy had been the superior choice for the role. Sammy read Marshal Thompson's confrontation dialogue with such natural authority and authentic Western sensibility that the entire set fell silent, recognizing that they were witnessing the performance the film was supposed to have. It wasn't just better acting, remembered actor Chill Wills, who played the film's villain. It was a completely different level of understanding about what Western heroism actually meant. Sammy embodied the character in ways that made Glenn's performance look like amateur community theater. But Sammy wasn't finished demonstrating his superiority. When the scene required Marshal Thompson to outdraw the villain in the film's climactic gunfight, Sammy's casual demonstration of the required quick-draw skills produced results that made Ford's extensive preparation look pathetically inadequate. The timing equipment recorded Sammy's draw at 0.05 seconds, faster than anything Ford could achieve even with preparation and multiple takes. Ford stood watching as Sammy effortlessly demonstrated every aspect of the role he had stolen through political influence rather than merit, and the humiliation was visible to the entire cast and crew. "You could see Glenn's confidence collapse in real time," observed Wills. He realized that everyone on set was comparing his performance to what they'd just witnessed, and that comparison was devastating to his professional ego. Director Stevens faced a terrible decision. The footage of Sammy performing Marshal Thompson was clearly superior to anything Ford had delivered, but contractual obligations and studio politics made it impossible to recast the lead role mid-production. George was in an impossible position, recalled producer William Wyler. He had documentation that the original casting decision was correct, but he couldn't act on that information without destroying his relationship with Columbia Pictures. The compromise solution was professionally devastating for Ford and personally humiliating in ways that would influence his career for years. Stevens decided to use Sammy's performance footage for wide shots and action sequences where the lead actor's face wasn't clearly visible, while keeping Ford's close-up scenes for dialogue that couldn't be replaced. The result was a film where the most heroic and dynamic Marshal Thompson moments were actually performed by Sammy Davis Jr., while Glenn Ford's contribution was limited to static conversation scenes that revealed his interpretive limitations. Thunder Mesa was released in December 1965 to reviews that specifically noted the inconsistency in the lead character's portrayal. Critics observed that Marshal Thompson seemed like two different people, dynamic and authentic in action scenes, mechanical and uninspired in dialogue scenes. Ford's performance as Marshal Thompson suffers from a strange inconsistency, wrote Variety's reviewer. In action sequences, the character displays natural authority and authentic Western sensibility. In dramatic scenes, Ford seems to be struggling with interpretation and emotional authenticity. The review didn't mention that the inconsistency was actually the difference between Sammy's authentic performance and Ford's mechanical interpretation, but industry insiders understood exactly what had happened. Box office results confirmed the critical assessment. Thunder Mesa performed below expectations, particularly in markets where Western authenticity was valued over star power. The film felt disjointed because audiences could sense the performance inconsistency, even if they couldn't identify its source, observed distribution executive Robert Solow. Ford's star power wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental casting mistake. Glenn Ford's career never fully recovered from Thunder Mesa. The film's failure, combined with the industry knowledge of what had really happened during production, damaged his reputation as a Western star and led to fewer and less prestigious role offers. Glenn had won the political battle but lost the war, reflected director George Stevens years later. He got the role through influence rather than merit, and the results proved why merit-based casting exists in the first place. For Sammy Davis Jr., the Thunder Mesa experience became a reference point for discussions about how talent could transcend political obstacles and how authentic capability would eventually be recognized even when it was initially denied. That experience taught me that stolen opportunities have a way of exposing themselves, Sammy reflected in a later interview. You can use politics to get a role, but you can't use politics to perform it. Talent always reveals itself, and the absence of talent always becomes obvious. Years later, when film historians analyzed the Western genre's evolution during the 1960s, Thunder Mesa became a case study in how industry politics could override artistic merit to the detriment of both individual careers and film quality. The behind-the-scenes footage of Sammy performing Marshal Thompson was eventually released as part of a documentary about Hollywood casting practices, providing definitive evidence of what the film could have been with merit-based decision-making. Glenn Ford's theft of the Marshal Thompson role had seemed like a career victory when it happened, but the long-term consequences proved that authentic capability couldn't be displaced by political maneuvering. It could only be temporarily obscured before reasserting itself in ways that exposed the inadequacy of those who had tried to replace it.